From Los Angeles, Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring face-to-face encounters by well-known authorities with differing views on vital issues confronting our present-day world. The topic, offshore oil, costs versus benefits. Now, here is Peter Hackis.
The nation's continuing shortage of oil has brought a new urgency to the search for additional sources of this vital commodity. Geologists have reported there are indications that billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas lie underneath the outer continental shelf adjacent to the U.S. coastline. Bearing in mind some unhappy past experience with offshore drilling, many Americans are calling for a go-slow approach to the drilling of new wells in the outer continental shelf. There are many questions to be answered before such drilling takes place. For example, should there be a separation of exploration and production, different companies doing each, possibly with the federal government itself doing the original exploration? Just what are the chances of new oil spills leading to new Santa Barbara-type pollution? Should there be such oil spills and pollution, who should clean it up? When this new oil and gas are available, who should benefit financially? The states off whose shores the drilling takes place, or all the people of the United States? The most immediate question is this. In view of the potential value of offshore oil and the potential environmental risk involved in drilling for it, who should be making the decisions on how to proceed? Welcome to another roundtable discussion presented by the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. With us today are four experts well-versed in the topic offshore oil, costs versus benefits. Acting as moderator for this discussion is Tom Bradley, Mayor of Los Angeles. Mayor Bradley has served in his present position since July 1973. Prior to becoming mayor, Mr. Bradley spent several years as a Los Angeles city councilman. He began his career with a law degree and was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department for 21 years. More recently, Mayor Bradley has served as president of the National League of Cities. He is a member of the advisory board of AEI's National Energy Project. Now, Mayor Bradley.
I'm delighted to welcome to Los Angeles the National Energy Project and this important discussion of the energy problems. It's appropriate that we should come to Los Angeles to talk about offshore oil drilling, costs versus the benefits. We have a distinguished panel to discuss this matter, and I'm pleased to introduce first Mr. H.J. Haynes, Chairman of the Board and Chief Executive Officer of Standard Oil Company of California, seated to my far right. To my immediate right, Mr. Jacques Cousteau, internationally known explorer, philosopher, poet, a man who opened up for millions the world under the sea, distinguished television performer and producer, and we're delighted to have you with us. To my immediate left, Governor of the state of New Jersey, Mr. Byrne. And then to the far left, the Assistant Secretary of the Department of the Interior, Mr. Royston Hughes. Welcome. Governor Byrne, will you open up the discussion this morning with your opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. The subject which has been under discussion here is cost versus benefits of offshore oil. I'm the governor of New Jersey. Unusually, governors of the coastal states don't see eye to eye generally on any subject, but on this subject I think there is close to unanimous point of view, and that is that we ought to proceed with full knowledge. We want to know what's going on in the development of offshore oil. And let's analyze how we, if we didn't know what Mr. Hughes or Secretary Morton and the government was doing, would do about the development of a resource under our ocean, near our coastline, especially in the area of a state which has a very sensitive coastline. I think what we would do, we would pool all of the information that we had We would ask the federal government, the Department of Interior, to get as much information as possible. We'd ask the oil companies somehow to pool their resources to make available the information that they could gather. And then getting all of that information, we would proceed step by step with some rational plan, very cautiously, to develop offshore oil. We would want to know what the effects are in the ocean, what the effects would be onshore, and what the best way of handling those effects and adjusting for them, preventing them, balancing them. That, I think, would be the solution that we would normally come to. The worst possible solution would be to divide offshore into a series of huge tracts and put those huge tracts out for bid and say the highest bidder is going to get a shot at exploring and developing those tracts, and once the bid is out, good luck. Now, we think that the federal government started a lot closer to the second alternative than to the first alternative. And we raised our voices against that. We think we've made some progress. We think Mr. Hughes and Mr. Morton are beginning to see the dangers in that. The governors are willing to see the development of offshore oil. We want to see it done rationally. We want to see it done so that we protect the citizens of our states and of the United States. We want to see an optimum result. We're not obstructionists, we're realists, and we're looking out for the best interests of our people, and we think and hope all of the people.
Thank you very much, Governor Byrne. Mr. Haynes, will you take up on this issue and have perhaps a different point of view?
Well, Mr. Chairman, this subject of offshore drilling has, to say the least, has become somewhat emotional and somewhat confusing. The fact is that this nation is consuming more oil than it is producing. I think the statistics will show that in 1950, we were importing essentially no oil from foreign sources. This year, I think we'll probably be dependent upon about 40% of our oil requirements from foreign sources, and unless something is done by 1977 or 1978, we'll be importing perhaps 50% of our oil requirements. I was reading an article in one of the major newspapers the other day, and one or two things struck me as being quite pertinent. One is that this nation is spending as much money on imported oil today as it was spending on the Vietnam War at its peak. The same article went on to say that if we were to incur another embargo, such as the one that occurred in the winter of 73 and 74, that it could mean the loss of 2 million jobs in this country and perhaps could affect our gross national product by some $50 to $80 billion. Now, I think everyone on this panel will agree that with those facts, we should get on with some kind of a program that would minimize our dependence on foreign sources of energy. I think everyone will agree to that. Now, there's no question but what our country has an abundance of alternate energy resources. Certainly, we have abundance of coal. We have the potential for expanding our nuclear generating capacity. We have potential for gasifying coal, for liquefying coal. Certainly, we have tremendous shale resources. And certainly, all of these alternate resources, if you will, should be pursued. They should be developed. And certainly, the industry, the oil industry, is willing to and ready to play its part in the development of these alternate resources. But we need a national energy program, if you will. We need a stable economic and political climate within which to get this job done. Now, having said that, I think I should point out, however, that in my judgment, all of these alternate energy resources will not play a substantial role in solving our energy problem, certainly not for the next decade and perhaps for as much as 15 years. So, therefore, I don't see any alternative to the short term, and by that I'm talking about the next decade, than to explore and develop our domestic oil and gas resources. And certainly the experts in this field have made studies. The U.S. Geological Survey has made a study, the NPC, the National Academy of Science, and while they differ in terms of their projection as to the potential, I think they all conclude that the greatest potential for additional oil and gas in this country lies in the outer continental shelf and in Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Captain Cousteau, it's your turn.
First, I am a little embarrassed to be here in this panel as a foreign citizen. And my only reason to have accepted is that I'm paying my taxes in the U.S. Otherwise, I would have turned it down.
You've earned your right to speak.
So, and also because I spend most of my time here when I'm not at sea. I'm very disturbed by the fact that in this conference we have been discussing the cost and benefit of offshore drilling, but our starting point was always granted that it was definitely needed. And this need was never really substantiated by studies or figures. It was just assumed as an axiom. That, I'm not saying that offshore drilling is not needed. I'm just saying that during this conference, this point has not been demonstrated. The second thing, looking at this problem from a double point of view. A, as, let's say, an ocean explorer and leader of scientists, if I don't put the term scientist to myself. And as a man who has time to think from outside on my bridge with documents or at sea. I think that everybody is talking about short-term independence, and that this attitude of short-term independence for this country may be more dangerous than temporary dependence and long-term independence. So if I may explain this, of course we know, and the Europeans know very well what it costs to buy energy outside. Here you buy maybe 40 to 50%, we buy 90% in France from the Arabs at the cost, the price you know. So this is a terrible drain to our economy also. So we know what it means. But we are in a time of relatively easy international affairs, even if the headlines of some papers dramatize things. Let's say that it has been rarely as easy as now for the Western world. And this may not last forever. We may face in 10, 15, 20 years some very critical strategical problems where easy oil energy will be required. If we have quickly burned for expediency our last reserves which lie offshore, in time of peace and easiness, in time of hard time, we will be without any kind of resources and we will be strangled. So this is, if you wish, my general approach to this problem. I know that technically offshore drilling is feasible, that the protection of the environment can be dealt with in ways that we may talk about later on. I know that all the technical problems can be solved. And also I know that probably a temporary bridge with offshore oil may be necessary But we have to develop right now, with enormous funding, other sources of energy, and especially of the renewable kind and of the non-polluting kind.
Thank you very much, Captain Cousteau. Secretary Hughes, can we hear your point of view?
Thank you, Mayor Bradley. It's certainly a pleasure to have the opportunity to explain the government's position and role with respect to offshore drilling. Our topic today is costs and benefits, and we might mention that in 1970, this country spent $3 billion for offshore oil. Last year, we spent $24 billion, and we think that's a significant cost to the American public, so that we feel that in the total array of energy sources that the American public can be provided with, offshore oil for the near term, as Mr. Haynes has said, provides the one real additional source of domestic supply. We in this country use about 17 million barrels of oil per day. We produce about 11 million barrels of oil per day. And that 11 million barrels is declining by some percentage point. Last year it was 8%. Maybe next year it might drop to 6%. But over the short term, over 10 years, there will be a significant decline in production of domestic American petroleum resources. And we think that it's incumbent from a public policy standpoint for the government to ensure that we conduct an orderly program to determine where our additional resources are. And we certainly are concerned about the prospect of using up our fossil fuel resources now and not having any to serve us later on. However, we really don't think we're faced with that dilemma with respect to the offshore oil program. Our program right now is an orderly program of a series of sales over 4 years to explore the remaining areas of the outer continental shelf to tell us where the oil is and where the oil is not. We recognize that conditions can change either on the strategic level or certainly on the domestic production levels that would require that we drop off from a given schedule. We think that the government's program certainly has the flexibility to deal with changes in the energy situation in this country. However, because of the long lead times involved in a program like offshore drilling, we think it's incumbent on the government and certainly the American public to support a program which will provide us with those resources when we're going to need them, and perhaps if we're going to need them, if there's some major change in the system. The government certainly recognizes that as the program expands from its traditional area of operation in the Gulf of Mexico, that we certainly have to explain our program a little more carefully to the new states and new people who are going to be involved with the prospect of offshore oil drilling. We recognize that there are certain impacts that the program may bring about, and we are trying to come to grips with the problems that the states will have from offshore drilling in their immediate vicinity. We believe that we have made a series of changes in the program which will meet many of the objections people have about the program. And I think the most important change, and one that I hope we can discuss in a little more detail in the remaining period of the program, is a commitment on the government's part to work much more closely with the states on the entire program of offshore drilling, trying to include state officials in the process by which the ultimate decision is made to lease or not lease.
Gentlemen, you've each expressed a point of view, and it seems to me coming out of this whole discussion thus far, the central issue, Governor Byrne saying that not so fast, hold up, let's have a little more orderly process. Secretary Hughes is saying that we think this is a reasonable process and a well-timed phasing of this program, and that we want to involve the states. I didn't hear you say cities. I know you intended that. Captain Cousteau says that we have seen no demonstrable evidence here in this conference that we ought to be drilling on the outer continental shelf first, that we ought to do some of the near-term things, the alternate sources of energy. And Mr. Haynes saying that there is only a limited amount of oil available in this country and in the world, and we better get on with it. That it's going to take 10 to 15 years even to bring it ashore for refining. And I think we ought to pursue that a little bit and see if we can better define this question of priorities, the question of urgency of this particular idea.
Mayor Bradley, may I correct perhaps a misunderstanding? I certainly didn't intend to suggest that there was a shortage of oil in the world. Indeed, there is an adequate supply of oil in the world. Our problem is right here in the United States, and my thesis is that we should minimize our dependency on these foreign sources for the many reasons which, of course, Secretary Hughes mentioned. And so I didn't want to mislead you. There's an awful lot of oil in the world, but unfortunately, here in the United States, we're consuming an awful lot more than we produce here in the United States. And I think just in the interest of our basic economy, perhaps also in the interest of national security and those things, it behooves us to minimize our dependency on foreign sources. So that's the main thrust of my
Perhaps I inadvertently attributed to you comments that have been made that there's a finite supply of oil in the world.
Well, I don't think there's any question but what oil is in finite supply, but I want to make sure that there, at the present time and for the foreseeable future, there is an abundance of oil in the free world. There's just no question about that. I think we're all aware of the fact that there are many millions of barrels a day of surplus producing capacity at the present time in the Middle East and other OPEC countries. But it is finite, but at least for the foreseeable future, there's an awful lot of oil. Unfortunately, for us as Americans, 2/3 of the oil in the free world happen to be located in the Middle East, and perhaps over 70% of the oil in the free world is in the OPEC countries.
Well, what terrifies me is that we are saying there's a lot of oil elsewhere that's not in the U.S., so let's burn it quick. I don't understand that.
Well, I think, Dr. Cousteau, our position is not so much to burn it quick, but because of the lead times involved, our process, the orderly process I referred to earlier, takes 1 year to go from the government's request to find interest in the oil companies and other entities as to whether or not they want to sail in a given area. We take 1 year up to the decision to have a sail. From that, our experience tells us it's 1 to 3 years before exploration will occur. It's 3 to 8 years beyond that point in time when development might occur should oil be found. And I think we all ought to keep in mind that the oil business is a speculative business. The oil companies, in a very real sense, are high rollers. They're gambling that there is oil in a given area, and they may in fact lose. But the time frames needed to accomplish the system as it now operates are in years rather than months or days, so that if we delay now for several years in order to determine whether or not the system could be a little better, our concern is that 10 years from now we might find that we started 5 years too late, and we might be faced with a massive change in American lifestyle that we hadn't really planned on.
The governors have been sort of portrayed as the heavies in this whole debate. And maybe we want to clear that up a little bit with Mr. Hughes and Mr. Haynes. If the governors all of a sudden today withdrew every objection they had to offshore drilling, where would you be? Would you proceed tomorrow?
I think it's our intention to proceed with the orderly process that we've outlined, Governor, and we certainly don't think the governors are the heavies in this process. There are other groups that are concerned, as well as the state officials, about the conduct of the program. But we think it's in the national interest to proceed with an orderly plan to develop our resources, to have them available for the American public, and we intend to proceed within the context of existing laws to do that.
Are we lousing up an orderly plan that you've had and you have, Mr. Hughes?
No, I think we've sharpened the debate as to the issues involved, and that's what our system of government's all about.
You got a plan now that would let you go ahead tomorrow?
Depends on where you mean, Governor. We intend to resume, if your reference is to the Atlantic, resume our schedule and issue a call for nominations in the near future in the Atlantic.
Got an environmental impact statement that will let you do that now?
Not yet. That's part of the process.
I see.
The decision to lease will not be made until all these things you referred to have been accomplished.
You had an environmental impact statement in October.
That environmental impact statement is a statement that covers the entire program. We, for each given sail area, do a site-specific environmental impact statement, which takes into account the local environmental factors.
You don't want anybody to believe that that environmental impact statement would justify offshore drilling today, do you?
Well, we think the statement justifies
That would have justified it?
in an overview sense, to cover the 17 areas in the Outer Continental Shelf, ranging from Alaska through the entire east, west coast, and Gulf of Mexico.
You had hearings on that environmental impact, preliminary environmental impact statement, did you not?
That's correct.
Some in Trenton, some here. I didn't hear anybody justify that environmental impact statement as one which would be adequate to justify drilling offshore today.
Well, I think there were some supporters, and I know they can be characterized as only the oil industry, but we feel that the offshore program certainly enjoys a great deal more support than the persons who came out in opposition to the program at these public hearings.
I don't care about counting noses now. I care about whether the environmental impact analysis you've done so far in the federal government is adequate, an adequate basis on which to proceed. That's simply the question.
If your question is, will we make some additional changes in the statement, the answer is yes, but we think by and large the statement is adequate.
You could have gotten away with that statement.
Well, we don't like to use that sort of term. We think the statement was done in good faith, and the statement does in fact meet the requirements of the NEPA Act and the general concerns that act is meant to protect.
Governor Byrne, I think your reputation as a prosecutor is well earned. You really sort of pursued this, and now let's see if we can get over to some of our other panelists. There's a common question about whether or not we need to proceed so quickly on this question of drilling offshore, since there is a claim that even if you were to proceed today, you couldn't extract the oil, you couldn't bring it in, you couldn't refine it, short of 8, 10, maybe a longer period of time. Mr. Haynes, you want to react to that?
Mayor Bradley, this subject is always put into the frame of should we move so rapidly? I think we ought to ask ourselves another question: should we continue to delay this process? Because the oil industry has been asking for accelerated leasing offshore for years and years and years, and certainly now we obviously we respect the efforts of the various interested parties, the environmentalists on the one hand, the states on the other hand. We respect all of that. We've advocated some time ago, and we've gone on record that there should be some mechanism where the coastal states should share in whatever benefit the federal government derives from this economic benefit. But I get a little bit concerned that the subject is always discussed in the context, should we proceed so rapidly, when in fact it has been delayed almost to the point to where I think it borders on irresponsibility. Because now on the other hand, if the public is willing to accept additional dependence, if you will, on foreign sources of energy, I've already said there's a lot of oil in the world. And as Mr. Cousteau has said, the world is relatively in a stable political environment right now. There's no reason to think that we can't continue to bring this oil in. But I remind you of the point I made in my opening statement, and that is that we are still subject to a political embargo, if you will, that is always front and center. And a political embargo, I repeat, if it happens again, it's not just inconvenience. It's not just long lines at service stations. I didn't like those any more than anybody else did. My wife read Exodus sitting in service station lines to give you an idea of how long it was. But we don't like those things. But those things are just inconveniences. What I'm concerned about is the underlying economic system that we've got here, and I think we ought to be concerned about jobs. I am, and I think all of us should be. And this is so important. Now, if we wanted to keep delaying, I repeat, I don't want to be put in the position of defending moving quickly. I'd like for somebody to say, why have we delayed this process for the last 2 or 3 years?
Mr. Haynes, then perhaps we ought to ask Secretary Hughes about the delay, because those who serve at the state and city level, those who are described as the environmentalists, really had this discussion, this debate sharpened only in the course of the last year, and they had the program environmental impact statement thrust upon them in the latter part of last year with only a few weeks to react to it, to respond to it. And perhaps if that environmental impact statement had been prepared years ago, certainly earlier than it was, had the states and the cities and others been given a chance to carefully evaluate it, we would then be at the point where we could say, this is a clear and justified decision. But I think that was the problem that arose, and even now, Mr. Hughes, the cities and the states are being told that even though you acknowledge that you're going to have to make some changes in that initial environmental impact statement, apparently you want to proceed with the site-specific environmental impact statement even before there is a change in your earlier statement.
That's correct, Mayor Bradley. I might address first the question of why the delay. I think all of us through the period of the 50s and the 60s went merrily on our way trying to avoid hard decisions on energy in this country, assuming that there never would be a problem with energy supply. Perhaps those now in hindsight were bad decisions, but they tended to be the decisions on which the government at all levels operated. I think what sharpened the issue in everybody's mind was the change in price for foreign oil from $2.50 or $3 a barrel to $11 or $12 a barrel, which skyrocketed energy costs throughout this country and caused massive disruptions. Government has responded with respect to the OCS program with a desire to accelerate the program in an orderly, legal process, but admittedly an acceleration of the program. On the matter of our position with respect to the programmatic statement, the environmental impact statement written on the government's decision to accelerate the program versus site-specific statements, and one in particular, the one for Southern California. We think, again, that it's in the national interest that we proceed with our orderly process. There's no attempt to do any of this business in a closet. We recognize that if the final decision on the California sale is to go ahead, we will have to precede that statement, that decision, within a single process oriented only towards Southern California. That's why we've issued a site-specific statement for Southern California, and that's why we intend to hold public hearings in Southern California in the near term. The decision that is most critical, we think, is the decision to hold the sale, not the decision to issue a call for nominations or the decision to issue an environmental impact statement in a site-specific sense. And I recognize we have an honest disagreement as to whether or not the state and local governments have had ample opportunity to examine the program, but we come down to a traditional federal versus local concern, a national versus a local perspective on a given problem.
Is Mr. Haynes suggesting that we should have developed the Baltimore Canyon, for instance, years ago?
Well, Governor, to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't learn of the exploration potential of the Baltimore Canyon until just a few years ago. Huh? And I know our geologists have been looking up and down the East Coast, and I'm sure all of our competitors' geologists have been looking up and down the East Coast like they have been all over the world. But the Baltimore Canyon became a household word, if you will, in the oil industry only a short while back.
So that you're not criticizing anybody for not having developed. As a matter of fact, it would have been economically unfeasible to develop it a few years ago, isn't it?
It probably would have. But so now, Governor, may I finish answering your question, though?
Sure.
When you say to develop the Baltimore Canyon, I'd like to make a point abundantly clear that we don't know whether there's a teacup full of oil in the Baltimore Canyon area. Now, there may not be enough oil to put in that glass. What we're talking about is the potential for oil, and unless we get on with this program, we're not going to know whether there's enough oil out there.
I'd just like to get one thing clear, and that is you, and I think there's been an organized campaign by the oil companies to talk about jobs, and anybody who wants the orderly development of the Baltimore Canyon or anybody else is opposed to the creation or preservation of jobs in the United States. I think that's absolutely misleading and untrue. And I think if you will answer a few questions, like when should we have developed the Baltimore Canyon, what have you got against the orderly development of the Baltimore Canyon or any other offshore oil resource will put that whole issue in a good perspective.
May I answer those questions? Because first of all, when you say that the idea of relating energy to jobs is an organized campaign, to be perfectly frank with you, I think this is the first time that I've ever spoken to the subject publicly, so I can assure you it's no part of any campaign as far as I'm concerned. I just happen to believe it. I believe very strongly about it. But we keep talking about developing the Baltimore Canyon. Governor, my remarks a moment ago had to do with the general subject. You know, that we're not just talking about exploration potential offshore New Jersey. We're talking about exploration potential all up and down the East Coast. We're talking about the Gulf of Alaska. We're talking about Southern California. We're talking about, in effect, every bit of the outer continental shelf of the United States wherein there appears to be any potential for oil and gas. So we're not directing this just to the Baltimore Canyon. As I say, I hadn't even heard of the Baltimore Canyon until 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm not suggesting that anybody's to be criticized for not having gotten on with the Baltimore Canyon. All I'm saying is that apparently there's a certain amount of criticism here on behalf of various groups that the federal government is proceeding too rapidly. I'm just suggesting that they have delayed too long, and I think that's true. I can go back and cite what the oil industry kept telling the public and the government back in the 1950s on natural gas. Now, we don't like to deal in hindsight, but we were talking about that problem as early as 1952 and 1953. And what we said has now borne fruit. There's a shortage of natural gas in this country. It's serious, and I know it affects your good state, Governor. And I'm not suggesting.
We don't mind you criticizing the federal government. We're doing it.
Well, I'm not
criticizing the federal government's policy to how.
I'm not criticizing.
How effective they're being on pursuing the shut-in wells that some of the oil companies may have.
Well, I'm not criticizing
look at that.
The federal government. I'm not criticizing. Look, I'm very much aware of the fact that one thing that impeded the getting on with an accelerated offshore leasing were the accidents that the industry had. I'm very much aware of that. And these accidents were very, very regrettable. And believe you me, I think the industry regretted them more than anybody
You've
did.
improved the technology since Santa Barbara, have you not?
Well, the government's improved their.
There's no question but what the oil industry has improved its technology, the government has improved its operating requirements, and
all this has been
great
for
strides.
the good, has it not?
All of this has been for the good, Governor. I agree with you. Now, but I'd like to get back to these accidents, though, if I will, for just a moment. I think 4 accidents out of 18,000 wells is a pretty good record, and it's not perfect, and neither can we guarantee a perfect performance in the years to come. But, Governor, we all took a risk getting out of bed this morning, to a certain extent, but I think we all look forward to it. All I submit is that the risk of offshore drilling, it is there, and I don't want to hide it. But in my opinion, it's an acceptable risk. I mean, we've just simply got to establish priorities. Now, I guess if I'm criticizing the government, I guess I'm really saying that I wish the federal government and the states could get together, and the cities, and let's get on with this problem. We've been talking about an energy program for months and months and months. We don't have one, and this country, in the meantime, has a problem. And we would be, as an oil industry, we would be irresponsible if we didn't make these points abundantly clear.
Mr. Hughes will tell you we have been getting together.
Good. And if we can be of any help, we'd be delighted to do so.
May I ask for a comment by Captain Cousteau with regard to the accidents, as you call them, the harm, the danger to the sea and onshore? And I think, as well as anyone, you are familiar with these areas. What is your judgment on this?
It's obvious that an oil spill is a disaster. Nevertheless, the record of the industry, as you say, is that a lot more damage has been done by transportation of oil than by drilling. True?
I will accept I don't know the statistics.
There are many times more.
Right, I'll accept that as
So recently, 2 supertankers, one in Cape of Good Hope, one in Chilean channels on the southern tip, have spread devastation in big areas. Okay, so transportation is responsible for a lot more trouble than offshore oil drilling. There's no question about that. Nevertheless, an oil spill in a well that is not far away from shore is a local disaster. It is a local and temporary disaster, but it is a disaster. And what worries me only is that for the oil industry as well as for nuclear plants, those who may damage are the ones that control themselves. It means that you are controlling your own safety, the atomic energy is controlling their own safety, and nobody else has the right to investigate. So I would strongly recommend that if offshore drilling is to be made, that an independent agency would be commissioned to control the safety measures that have been taken for such drilling.
Mayor Bradley, I think it might be appropriate for me to respond at this point. We certainly take exception to Captain Cousteau's remark that the federal government does, in fact, control the oil industry.
That's not an independent agency, I'm sorry.
Well, they're independent of the oil industry.
Yeah, we at least are independent of the oil industry.
Not so much.
Oh, yeah.
No, I disagree.
All right.
You have the same interests. So we think that somebody else, totally independent, like the Academy of Sciences, for example, should commission an organization to control.
Well, since the Santa Barbara spill, the federal government, as was mentioned a moment ago, has made a number of changes in the operation of the offshore program. The number of inspectors has increased almost tenfold. The number of operating orders and safety requirements the companies are required to adhere to has increased considerably, and the safety costs to the industry itself have certainly escalated a great deal. Additional research has been accomplished in the matter of spill containment and many of the other areas associated with potential spills. We recognize that the probability always exists that there might be an accident. So long as humans are involved in a business like the oil industry or any other industry, there's always the probability. But we think the probability is darn small at this point. And we think of the two alternatives of massive tanker traffic versus increased offshore operation, that offshore operation is certainly the lesser of those two options in terms of potential.
You're right.
Mr. Secretary, if you feel that there is a minimal possibility of damage from the oil drilling, is the Department of the Interior willing to set up some kind of a liability procedure to protect those who may be damaged if, in fact, a spill occurs?
As a matter of fact, Mayor Bradley, we are now within the administration trying to come down on the final wording of an unlimited liability bill, which would establish a front-end fund so that communities like Santa Barbara, if faced with a repetition, and we certainly hope that never comes about, but if a community was subject to an oil spill, there would be money available immediately, not over a period of 4 or 5 years, to meet the disaster when it occurs, to help that community pull itself back together after an oil spill. We think the climate in the Congress is certainly going to be very good for an unlimited liability bill. And as I'm sure all of us are aware, the Congress is debating several other issues related to the Outer Continental Shelf program, but this is one that we in Interior certainly support. There will be a debate over the actual numbers involved, but it certainly makes good sense from our standpoint.
Okay, well, before these decisions are made, then do you think it's appropriate that the program be continued on its schedule?
We think it's appropriate that the program be continued. The Congress in the next 4 to 8 weeks will probably come to some decision on the matter of general changes in the OCS program. Hopefully this term, the Congress will take up the issue of an unlimited liability bill. And again, because of the time frames involved, even if we should have a sale in Southern California in the early fall of this year, it would probably be at least another year to 3 years before anything occurs in the way of drilling. And we think there's ample time for such a provision to be enacted. But if we waited until each of the concerns is resolved in both the immediate OCS program itself and until we have a buttoned-down national energy policy, it might be several years, and we think that's not good for the national interest, to continue to wait with each objection.
I have a big objection to this, which is basically that if there is unlimited liability compensation for this encourages irresponsibility, and the safety measures will be much stronger if taken in advance. This originates in always the same type of attitude. We prefer to clean the water when it's dirty than to avoid dirtying the water. We want to repair the damage done on the coast after it's done instead of avoiding doing the damage. It's always the same silly attitude. And now there is something also that yesterday shocked me very much during the discussions about the liability. How much are you going to evaluate the life of a bird, for example? Yesterday, it was discussed very abundantly if it will be $1 or $10. Nonsense. It has no value. It's something that is precious in itself and cannot be tagged with a price in dollars.
I think it might be appropriate, Mayor Bradley, to ask Mr. Haynes to give us some idea of what changes have been made in the way of safety in the oil industry since Santa Barbara, because considerable changes have been made. The industry has not stood still technologically, and we think the government has certainly increased its awareness on this issue.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I don't think time permits to enumerate all of the various things that have happened. I personally think we need to give the government a great deal of credit in this area, because you were mentioning the additional requirements that you have imposed on the industry in this area, and you mentioned the additional number of inspectors and so forth and so on. I started to interrupt you and say that, and yes, the number of reports that we have to file have multiplied by about 1 million-fold, but that's all good, and we accept that. And as I say, I think an awful lot of the improvements in operating practices and so forth are actually, and I'm delighted to have a chance to say something nice, because I think you may think I've been criticizing the government too much, but I think you gentlemen deserve a great deal of credit in this area. As far as the oil industry is concerned, certainly we've improved our technology. We spend
hand in hand.
We spend millions. Well, I'd hate to think we were not operating in concert, Mr. Cousteau, or
sure.
Else. I'll tell you something. When,
I would like
when
you
the
to
private
operate,
sector cannot.
I would like you to operate in concert with the public too.
Well, we're certainly willing to do that. But, well, I assume that to a certain extent the government is representative of the public. Now, that's a kind of an age-old philosophy that I think most of us have. But be that as it may, and not to belabor this point, Mr. Secretary, certainly we've improved our training. We've spent millions in research and development. We have formed, as you know, cooperatives to handle emergencies when they exist. As a matter of fact, thank goodness the one in San Francisco has only been called on once or twice, most recently by the Coast Guard. But we have made great strides, and I don't want to sit here and try to elaborate all of them. Obviously, we're spending a lot of money in research and development as far as our drilling techniques are concerned, our platform designs. We're working on underwater completions. We're doing an awful lot in this area. And
would you be against the Academy of Sciences looking into it?
Mr. Cousteau, I wouldn't be against that. As a matter of fact, I would think that when the government lays down certain regulations and operating restrictions and so forth, that they would seek the counsel and advice, and perhaps.
Why not?
I think that's great. We don't have any objection to that.
We've certainly
welcome
invited outside sources into the program.
Why not the Academy of Sciences, the highest authority in this field?
To do what exactly, though?
To name experts and to control their reports and to give an advice to the government.
Well, I think the Academy does give advice to the government. If your proposal is for the Academy to review the program to see whether or not it could be
to review
improved.
the safety rules, that's all.
No, but I think we would be opposed to asking the Academy of Sciences to undertake an operational program of safety and inspection, because they would be subject to the same sort of criticism that you're subjecting the federal government to now.
Why?
Why wouldn't they be?
Because
Scientists, we have scientists who work in our department, Dr. Capt. Cousteau. You imply that the National Academy would have scientists who are a little more objective.
Yes.
But where does the National Academy gain its funding from?
Well, it's various sources, not only the government.
Can I ask a question, because I think the inference was thrown out before that we've got an either-or situation on supertankers, that it's either supertankers or offshore drilling. Mr. Haynes, is that so? Would offshore resources eliminate the need for the supertanker? Well,
Governor, I think the easiest way to answer that question is that if we don't get on with offshore exploration and find some oil, I might add, and produce it, then we're going to be more dependent on foreign source material. Now, there's no way to get this foreign source of oil into this country other than by tankers. Now, you chose the term specifically supertanker. There's no way to bring a supertanker or a VLCC, the so-called 200,000 ton class and above. There's no way to bring one of those tankers to the United States because we don't have a port facility in the United States to accommodate it. I think it's horrendous that we don't have, because it merely means that the consuming public is paying a premium for transporting oil in smaller tankers. But there's just no question. If we import more oil, the only way to get it here are in tankers. So yes, it'll increase the tanker traffic. I don't think the debate today or the discussion should be on the advantages of the VLCCs versus the small tankers. But
I didn't want to make that the issue. I just wanted to make sure that we're not on an either-or situation here.
Well, I don't think there's any question, but what you're going to have additional tanker traffic to this country because there's no other way to get here.
In any event.
Well, no, as a matter of, obviously, to the extent that we can find and develop oil offshore, that will displace imports to whatever extent that we're successful in so doing.
For a few years.
Well, until we can get on with some of these alternate sources of energy that you...
We did not try.
That's
my entire point today, and I've not come to it yet, is that we would support this temporary bridge of offshore oil drilling very much, heartfully, if there was a monumental program for alternate non-polluting sources, which does not exist.
Well, Captain Cousteau, I think the government does have programs for the alternate sources.
Yes, I know, but this program that I happen to know, are ridiculously small compared to the amount of investment that is necessary. I have all the information here. You need a total of about $1 trillion in 15 to 20 years. Where are they? And this, of course, has not to be paid entirely by the federal government alone, but it has to be paid by the economy entirely. So if such a program is not adopted, then the program of offshore drilling is just a temporary tent of oxygen before we die from suffocated from the lack of energy and at the mercy of the Arabs. That's exactly what is going to happen in 20 years.
Well, Mr. Cousteau, the oil industry certainly supports a very massive
I'm not
research into... I know that. I just want to be on record here that we support a very massive research and development program in this area.
Yes, I know.
The oil industry is, at least as far as my company is concerned, I can't speak for the whole industry, but I feel confident that others are doing the same thing. We're spending sizable sums in research and development in coal gasification, coal liquefaction, shale oil development, and things of that nature, solar energy, geothermal energy. But our conclusion is that it's still going to be 10 or 15 years before those sources become available to us. And I might also add,
15 to 20.
Mr. Cousteau, that the cost of these alternate sources of energy are nowhere near what the figure that's being bandied about in the press and in Washington and elsewhere, because I can almost assure you that at $6 or $7 a barrel, and I'm talking about $1975 now, there's not going to be an awful lot of shale oil or coal liquefaction or coal gasification or tar sand development. It's just not economically feasible. You're talking about numbers that are in excess of $14 to $15 a barrel. This is not to say we shouldn't do it.
No.
But I think we should recognize that it's not going to be cheap.
And these alternate sources of energy that are the only ones that are now considered really the only major ones that are considered in the national program are like coal gasification or coal, and to a lesser degree tar sands and shale oil, are either potentially heavily polluting sources of energy or land-destructing sources of energy. And the only sources of energy that are absolutely pollution-free and that are in tremendous abundance in this country, which are geothermal and solar, these two are considered as forgotten, utopian, and when...
I hope not, because we're doing some work in that area right now.
So, you said yourself to a small degree because you don't have the appropriate support from the authorities. But the federal government has to turn its program to the non-polluting renewable sources of energy. And if they do so, I think there is not one environmentalist that would not support the program of offshore drilling.
Mr. Hughes has said that the government does have a program and is proposing money or spending money in this kind of research. Perhaps you can quickly tell us how much and in which areas.
Mayor Bradley, I think Dr. Cousteau disputes the figure, and we can get back to it later, but it's my understanding that the 1976 federal budget contains $53 million for solar energy research in this country, and that is a doubling over the amounts available in previous years in terms of federal programs. We are also spending tens of billions of...
all forms.
Pardon?
That includes all forms of energy.
Solar energy.
Solar energy. All forms of solar energy.
That's correct, yes. Okay. In addition, we're spending tens of billions of dollars in other fossil fuel research to deal with gasification and liquefaction. And on the point of geothermal resources, we are certainly continuing to explore and experiment with geothermal resources, but it is not the opinion of our experts at this time that geothermal will ever supply much more than a very small amount of the energy requirement in this country. But we're not giving up on it as an alternate source.
One other question of the government. Since there is some suspicion of any other research group, whether it's the government or the industry, what is the position of the Department of the Interior about the National Academy of Sciences conducting this research, conducting the review of the program and making its report?
We still have that question under advisement, and we're not willing to make a commitment at this point to have such a study, which would be conducted on the basis of suspending all activities in the program for some period of time, which is normally implicit in the suggestion that the National Academy do it. We are continuing to work with organizations like the National Governors Conference on the idea of a third party conducting a shoreside impact study that would have credibility, that would not be suspect because Interior or some other federal agency had done it. And we are certainly open-minded on the question of trying to find out more of the answers to some of the unanswered questions with respect to the program. But it's our basic contention that we can conduct the orderly program laid out in our tentative schedule and get these answers along the way rather than stopping everything now and waiting 1 to 5 years before we resume the program, which has a 5-year lead time on average.
But we're going to have to wrap it up. Certainly we want to thank our panel. Mr. Haynes, thank you very much. Capt. Cousteau, Governor Byrne, Secretary Hughes. Thank you very much on behalf of the National Energy Project.
During this AEI roundtable discussion, you have heard the divergent views of 4 experts in the field of offshore oil. It is the aim of the American Enterprise Institute to illuminate the issues of the day by presenting many such views in the hope that by so doing, those in decision-making positions will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion. I'm Peter Hackus in Washington.
Public Policy Forums is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C.
Now to our questions from the audience. Our first question here.
My name is Walter Mead, Professor of Economics, University of California, Santa Barbara. I have a question for Mr. Haynes. You spoke at length about the hazards of another embargo, the employment effects, the point that a second one would be a disaster. And then you said that the only solution, I think that is your exact wording, was offshore oil development. I think you might agree that it is part of the solution, but not the only solution. I was a little concerned that there was no discussion on the panel at all about the possibility of crude oil storage in order to set up a system to avoid the hazards that you spoke of an embargo, where a system of storage might be set up to provide us with 1 year of security, or 6 months, or 2 years. Could you comment?
I'd be very pleased to comment, Professor Mead. When I made the comment that offshore drilling was the only solution, I think I did add only a medium-term or short-term solution insofar as developing additional energy resources in this country. And I do stand on what I said. Now, as it concerns an embargo, I did comment on the effect. As a matter of fact, I think I quoted from one of the media as to their analysis of the effect of another embargo, and I think we were perhaps remiss in not addressing ourselves to storage, strategic storage, if you will. And I think it's an excellent idea. It's one, as you know, that the National Petroleum Council recommended perhaps a year or so ago, and perhaps less than that. And it's one in which my company wholeheartedly supports. It's part of the President's energy program, and I think it makes an awful lot of sense. And I hope that the debate between the administration and the Congress toward an energy program will soon be resolved, and that we'll have a program, and that program will include strategic storage, because I think it's certainly one solution to mitigate, if you will, the effect of another embargo.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Question over here.
Yes, John Tillinghast from the Alaska Attorney General's Office. I have two quick questions directed to Mr. Hughes. The first is that I wish you would expand on the problems with the tanker platform trade-off theory as they pertain to Alaska operations in the OCS. And second of all, with reference to your discussion with Dr. Cousteau on the objectivity or lack of objectivity in terms of regulation with USGS, I wish you'd answer why the Department of Interior has refused to require application of the best commercially feasible technology for exploration and development, despite the recommendations of the Academy of Sciences, despite the recommendations of EPA, and despite the recommendations of the Council of Environmental Quality. And second, if the Department of Interior is that objective, then why is it continuing the practice in the Gulf of Alaska of developing operating orders in consultation with industry prior to publication in the Federal Register, even though Dr. McElvey promised to the House Government Operations Committee that it would discontinue that practice and would give industry the same role in development of those orders as affected states and the interested public?
Okay, to try and answer the three issues you've raised. Number one, on the trade-off platforms versus tankers as it impacts Alaska, I think we all understand that Alaska is a unique case. Alaska is certainly more than self-sufficient in terms of fossil fuel resources, and they are going to be a net exporter to the other 49 states. So that the idea of us backing out tanker traffic to Alaska is certainly, not applicable as far as Alaska is concerned. We would expect that development of offshore areas in Alaska, and Alaska has several areas that we're certainly interested in exploring and perhaps developing in the near term. Once those resources are located, platforms would in fact be constructed, and tanker traffic would proceed from Alaska to the lower 48 to deliver that oil. But is that the point of the question you were raising about the trade-off? We recognize that Alaska is a giver and not a taker on the issue of resource, energy resource itself. On the matter of the government's non-recognition of best commercial technology and requiring its use, I must confess that I'm not acquainted with the issue specifically. I think we require a certain standard of excellence as far as the technology is concerned, and whether or not the cost-benefit trade-off in best technology available is an issue that we have not yet come to accept is something that we can certainly check and be in touch with you or Governor Hammond on. The final issue of our continuing to work with industry on the issue of putting operating orders together is something, again, that I'm unaware that there's been a great controversy on. We certainly need industry input in terms of the technology that industry is going to use in a given area, and Alaska is certainly a very hostile climate, and a climate in which new operating orders or variations in existing operating orders are going to have to be put together. But again, we can be in touch with you or the governor to confirm or deny Dr. McKelvey's commitment to a committee on the Hill.
Thank you. Next question.
Leonard Meeker, Center for Law and Social Policy in Washington. I'd like to address a question to both Captain Cousteau and to Mr. Hughes. It relates, first of all, to Captain Cousteau's proposal. And I'd like to ask him, first of all, what level of funding and effort you would consider appropriate today for pursuing the development of renewable and non-polluting energy sources, particularly solar energy. And I'd like to ask Mr. Hughes whether the government takes a different view on the appropriate level and effort today, and if so, what the reasons are.
Captain Cousteau.
Okay. The answer to your question is slightly complicated, but it is substantiated by a lot of research from my organization since several years. Not only my organization in this country, but also Eurocian, which I chair in Europe and groups the biggest industries in Europe. And we have consulted some very well-known study groups like Battelle in Switzerland and others. So, of course, the figures that I'm going to give you are within 30%, because it is very difficult to really estimate such things. Nevertheless, when we are talking about solar energy, up to now, let's say the world governments, I'm not saying pinning down this one, they're all doing the same, are diverting the question to the heating and cooling of houses, the same as when some environmental problems are given, you divert from the real problem, the issues, by inducing your children to pick up beer cans. This is the type of clever diversion from the real problem. The real problem is to bring energy, not only to heat and cool individual houses, to have huge plants making thousands of megawatts. And for this type of organization, we need huge sums of money. To give you very few figures, today, as I said yesterday, in order to make things easy to understand, instead of talking about BTUs or megawatts, which nobody understands really clearly, a large nuclear plant is producing 1,000 megawatts. It's a good unit. You've seen a nuclear plant somewhere. You know what it is. It's a big, costly thing. It produces 1,000 megawatts, more or less. So at the moment, the world consumption of energy is equivalent to 17,000 nuclear plants. We could extract from solar energy with an efficiency of 0.1%, the equivalent of 76,000 nuclear plants. I'm just giving this figure because then all the details of this could be. So, which means that we can, if we want to, and this country is exceptionally well located, both in Arizona or in such deserts, magnificently irradiated, or by the proximity of the Florida current, which in another way, indirect way, concentrates the solar energy in small places. 1 square yard of the Gulf Stream in the Florida Strait has 20 times more energy concentrated than 1 square yard in Arizona. So you have there a pre-concentrated, prefabricated source of energy. What I would like to see is a commitment to build a test plant of, let's say, 1,000 megawatt capacity. That would cost probably in the vicinity of $3 billion. And this would not be the only area of research, so that I think the first year of investment, either by direct funding or tax rebates or seeding money with industry joining, the first year budget should be at least $10 billion for geothermal and solar energy development, research and development. And this program would, if it developed properly, probably total in 15 years almost $1 trillion. That's what we have to face. But this is the price of total independence, and this country could be a big exporter of energy, because there is no other country that can export as much solar energy as you could.
Thank you, Captain Cousteau. Secretary Hughes?
Yes, I think I'd have to lead off by saying it's certainly it's difficult to dispute the work that some eminent scientists have done to put the study together. However, any decision to spend massive amounts of federal money on a program like this or any other are certainly always viewed in the cost-benefit arena. We have, to correct a figure I used earlier, in this year's budget, $153 million for all sorts of solar energy, which certainly is not the level that Captain Cousteau would support, but it's the opinion, at least, of experts in the government, and I'm sure some in the National Academy of Science, that that is the best program that the government could operate in the near term. We're certainly willing to look at Captain Cousteau's proposal, but the idea of adding a $10 billion burden to the existing budget burdens in the country for solar energy, when that might not be available for a matter of years, has to be viewed in the context of the entire energy spectrum. And in the short term, we continue to believe that we're going to be dependent on fossil fuels, and part of that belief stems from the cost-benefit calculation that the government should not spend either billions or $1 trillion right now for solar energy. But that's a decision that's certainly open to review every year.
No, but you just said something that I never said. I never said that this would preclude development of intermediate sources of energy. And what I just am sorry about is that we're always talking about short-term, short-term, short-term. That's all we are talking about. And I must say that a large segment of the population is looking a little further.
Thank you. There's a question in the second row back here.
I'm William Menard, Professor of Geology at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, and I have a question for Secretary Hughes, who I'm afraid is getting most of the questions here. There are several bills before the Congress proposing that the Department of the Interior or the government undertake a program of exploration of the continental shelf, including drilling, in order to get information for policy decisions. And I wonder if we could learn more of the Department's position with regard to these bills. And I believe I understood you to say that the Department feels that there would be a delay in drilling, or in development of the shelf, if the Department were to do the exploration. Could you explain why this delay would arise and how long it might be?
Sure. Let me kind of review the entire subject. We have several objections to the idea of the government either getting directly or indirectly into the exploration business. First of all, government control of the exploration phase implies that government will decide where the holes are to be drilled in the search for oil. And we have a large problem with that, because that centralizes decision-making in the oil business in either one person or one group of people, where now it is decentralized among the 50 or 60 companies that participate in the process. And all of us have to keep in mind that the oil business is a speculative business. The oil companies are, in fact, gambling. Each time they read their seismic information a certain way and make a decision to spend money on it, they're gambling. The most optimistic company in a given case will win the gamble in the competitive bid auction and will have an opportunity to see whether or not their decision was the right decision. To reduce the number of gamblers, if you will, or the people who analyze the information to one group, the government itself, we think is not in the national interest, because it can't help but reduce the probability of finding oil. First objection. Secondly, it would require that the government absorb the front-end money required to drill holes. Drilling on the Outer Continental Shelf will range somewhere between 1 and 10 million, per hole, depending on the type of climate that the drilling occurs in. In the Gulf of Mexico, it would probably be on the low end of the spectrum. As we go up into a more hostile area, in the areas offshore Alaska, it might be closer to 10 million per hole. That means that the government would have to pay those front-end costs. And as a person responsible for the budget in my department, the idea of going back to the Congress and saying, we just spent $50 million of the taxpayers' money and have 50 dry holes or 25 dry holes, now I want another 50 million to go forward to drill more holes, to me suggests that there would be interminable delays built into the process. Our system of government and the relationship between the federal and executive branch is not noted for its efficiency. As a matter of fact, it was intentionally designed that way so that there would be time to reflect on decisions. And we think if we shifted to that sort of system, there would be delays. Now, whether they would be good or bad delays is something we can debate for any period of time. Any change to make the government, either directly or indirectly, the entity responsible for drilling, we think would cause a delay in time just by the very nature of what change brings to government. We would have to decide who would make those decisions. We would probably have to either create a new entity or expand the U.S. Geological Survey to take on a new role. And there would be a reluctance to jump right in and make those decisions immediately, and a very proper reluctance, I'm sure, on the government officials' parts. So there would be a delay caused just in any shift over. But our basic objection is that we think that private industry in this country is doing the job very well. We think we've got the best oil industry in the world, and they're adequate to the problem, and we see no reason to delay. I might say we have made several changes in the program, and we're not saying that the program itself should be inviolate from change. And we are proposing, for example, that there be a ban on joint bidding among major companies in order to get away from the charge that, in fact, the major companies dominate the Outer Continental Shelf program. And we think that the ban on joint bidding is a proper action for the government to take. And I'm sure the oil companies, the large companies, as a group, object very strenuously to that sort of restriction. But we think it's in the public interest to do it. But, yeah.
Following that, Mayor, can I ask Mr. Hughes what Secretary Morton meant when he testified on March 14th, in part as follows? The National Governors Conference has called for a formal separation of decisions to lease in the area and to allow actual development in that same area. I support the objective of the National Governors Conference proposal in principle and have asked my staff to determine the administrative steps necessary to put that policy into force without introducing undue delay in development of the national energy resources. Our solicitor has informed me that such objectives could be accomplished.
Right. The Secretary did make that statement, and our rationale is that we think under existing law, the 1953 Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, we have the legal ability to create a pause between exploration and development. And we are now trying to staff out the consequences of what such a pause would create in terms of interest on the part of the oil companies to invest massive amounts of money and their time and effort in terms of the research they go through before they make bids on the OCS.
Does this testimony commit the Secretary to that concept?
We are trying to accomplish, yes, in a sense it does commit us to find a way to create the pause. We do not subscribe to the idea of the government conducting the exploratory phase, and we think we can accomplish the same goal that you and other governors are concerned about through existing law.
In further response to Dr. Menard's question, Mr. Haynes wants to make a comment as far as the industry is concerned on this question of...
Well, thank you, Mayor Bradley. I'd just like to say that I'm delighted to hear the Secretary make the observation that he felt as though the federal government should not become involved in the exploration phase of the oil business. And I want to commend him for that decision, because I happen to wholeheartedly agree with it for reasons, those that he mentioned and perhaps one or two more. I happen to be a little bit old-fashioned, but my basic concept of government is that government should do for the people what the people are not capable of doing for themselves. And to me, that's just so fundamental that It may sound trite to make such a statement, but I commend the government, certainly in the field of national defense, and they get real high marks, and in many other programs. But in all humility, I think the oil industry over the past several years has done a very, very commendable job in bringing an abundance of energy at a reasonable cost to the developed countries of this world and to the developing countries of this world. I think to get the federal government in the exploration end of the oil business would be an absolute disaster. And from a standpoint, you may recall most of my comments earlier today had to do with the delay that is being built into this process. I think it would delay it for years and years. As a matter of fact, I really don't think the advocates of the government becoming so involved really mean this. But if you take some of their statements literally, what they're suggesting is that the government go out and explore and make an absolute determination as to the amount of oil that is in a particular basin or a particular structure and what have you, and then open it up for bidding. In other words, the industry would be buying, if you will, oil in a tank. Well, now, I'd like to remind everyone that is interested in this subject that the Gulf of Mexico is one of the most prolific oil-producing basins, provinces in the United States. We've been producing oil there for 25 to 30 years, and we're still exploring for oil in that particular area. So if you take some of these statements literally, some people are suggesting that the U.S. government would spend 25 years determining how much oil is in an area before they decide to develop it. Now, furthermore, and I realize that may be an extreme, but I think it's a point people have to consider. And certainly, even on a given structure, a given salt dome, or whatever geologic configuration you want to talk about, you don't define in absolute terms the total reserves on that structure until you have drilled a few exploratory holes, a few delineation holes, you've installed some platforms, you've got some production history, you also drill development wells, you develop, you find oil years later in deeper horizons, and all of this sort of thing. So, I mean, I'm not trying to confuse this issue, but I just want to be sure that people understand that if you're really talking about separating exploration from producing or development and so forth, well, you've got to be real careful as to how you define exploration and producing. And furthermore, I'd like to suggest that if anyone really thinks that the federal government could do a better job than the private industry, I'd just like to commend to them a very quick analysis as to who in the world has found oil in the free world. And basically, it's the international U.S. oil industry. And there are a whole bunch of national oil companies all over the world, with the possible exception of what the Mexican oil company found a few months ago, after looking for some 25 years, I might add, and with some possible success by the Petrobras company in Brazil, very recently, I might add, after a long effort in this area. Really, the rest of the national oil companies in the world haven't found enough oil to put in that glass. So I think you need to keep this in the proper context. And I guess I want to fall back on my original point. The oil industry has done a commendable job. We've made some mistakes. We regret the mistakes. We've got a lot to be proud of, and I submit that we could do this job better than government. And if anybody questions that, look at the postal system or look at Amtrak or anything.
Can I just ask if you're so anxious to keep the government out of this, why you are also so anxious to take tax write-offs on your dry holes?
Well, Governor, we happen to be a business organization, and we have some 280,000 stockholders that have invested about $8 billion in our company.
Well, my only point is you are involving the government.
Well, we're involving the government
the
same way that a guy down the street has a factory and he depreciates his plant and equipment.
Okay.
But I don't quite see that analogy, because we're a profit-making organization. We've got the incentive, and if the government will give us the economic and political climate, we can get the job done.
All right, we're going to return to the audience for questions now. And if we can remind the panel, we know we cannot exhaust any one of these issues in a response, so if you'll keep it brief, we can get more questions from the audience. Gentleman in the front row.
I'm Richard Snowdy, head of the industry government activity for the National Management Association. My question is directed to Governor Byrne, and it's the matter that I noticed in your opening statement, Governor, that you seem to have some disenchantment with the fact that the offshore resources would be divided up and handed to the highest bidder. What alternative means of exploring can you offer? What combinations of applying resources to these?
Well, I don't know why Mr. Hughes or Mr. Morton has divided the offshore oil leases into such huge blocks. I don't understand where they got that number, how they got it, and how they justify it. Second, I'm not sure yet how they're going to price those leases. I would be strongly in favor of a pricing system which did not front load those leases, which made it a minimum commitment at the beginning and a higher commitment for the royalties. And I think Senator Benson from Texas has a bill which would go a long way to accomplishing that concept. In that way, the states, for instance, might on their own join in bidding for those leases, do the exploration, and then make the judgments as they went along. That's the reservation I have with respect to a huge commitment at the front end.
Question in the third row.
My question is for Mr. Hughes. I'm William Riley, President of the Conservation Foundation in Washington. I think a good deal of the concern about offshore oil has to do with onshore impacts as well as the spills that are troublesome. And in your environmental impact statement issued last year, an impact statement on the program of some 2,000 pages, you devoted about 20, as I recall, to onshore impacts. We have just completed a study in Scotland of the onshore impacts there and discovered that they're very considerable. The tank storage farms, refinery construction, pipelines, production rigs, and all of the rest of the things and the associated activities that go with them. Then, earlier this year, you proposed legislation to cite energy facilities, in some instances over and against the wishes of state and local governments. Now, my question is, what is going on in the department that would reassure people like Governor Byrne and the mayors as to the thought that you're putting into the very serious problems associated onshore with offshore oil and gas development to cause them to want to give you this kind of authority?
Okay, I might say that we would certainly admit that the department's role in the onshore impact question has changed over the last year to 18 months as we have thought in more detail about the impacts on states other than our traditional Gulf Coast area where the program has operated for 25 years. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we are within the department now engaged in a dialogue with the National Governors Conference staff on some third-party entity who might in fact be able to conduct an objective study on what onshore impacts are. I think all of us would have to keep in mind that onshore impacts vary with the type of locality that the development is projected near. In Alaska, for example, the tiny village of Yakutak in the Gulf of Alaska has 200 people and would look forward to an impact of perhaps several thousand people over a short period of time should large amounts of oil be found there, and that assumes that a decision would be made to have a sale. Needless to say, the state of Alaska has a tremendous problem in terms of basic infrastructure, roads, schools, sewage systems, etc. The impact in Southern California is different again, and the impact in New Jersey and the East Coast states would be different again. And we certainly are not trying to minimize the question of onshore impacts from offshore development. In fact, we're trying to get a better database upon which to encourage some changes in the system. I think the press has reported that we in Interior have at least been reviewing revenue sharing options, which might provide another source of support, financial support basically to states. But there are a lot of unknowns in the process, and we hope that working together with the states and perhaps the National Academy of Science, which may be the body that we ask to do this study, that we can get some outside expertise on a very complex problem. But we don't think the matter of shoreside impact, particularly at its present stage, is enough to say we ought to stop the entire program for 2 or 3 years. We think there's enough time in the built-in timeframes in the program as it operates to review the problem and see what we need to do to try and help with impacts, and again, over the range of impacts.
A question over here in the fourth row.
Yes, my name is Joe Edmonston, Southern California Coastal Coordinator for the Sierra Club. This is for Mr. Haynes. Standard Oil Company has been asking for a supertanker port near the Morro Bay estuary, and it's also been supporting the OCS drilling development in Southern California. And this has led some people to question whether or not we really are going to have a trade-off between tanker imports and OCS development. And I just read several days ago an analyst suggesting that what perhaps the oil companies are trying to do is develop the OCS and tanker imports to the extent that they can then justify sending North Slope Alaska oil to Japan. And I would like you to comment on that, please.
Well, I'd be delighted to comment on that. Let me take the last part of your question first, if I may. Our company has not been as successful in its exploration activity on the North Slope as have our competitors, and I'm very envious of that, but nonetheless, it's a fact. And I guess really what I'm suggesting is that we don't have enough production on the North Slope, or will not have, out of this Prudhoe Bay complex to export anywhere except our refineries in Southern California. So now if you take that and then get back to the fact that we are talking about a super port up near Estero, well then I think that the fact that we're talking about that and we're talking about OCS and we don't have any Alaskan oil to export, I think that probably answers your question, because I think the industry has made it abundantly clear that they have no intentions of trying to export the oil from those who have a lot of oil up there, I should say, have made it clear in the press and otherwise that they don't have any intentions of exporting that oil to Japan or anywhere else other than to the west coast of the United States, and hopefully by one way or another getting it inland. Now, on the contrary, we have talked about a super port, not only just in California, I might add, but we also are part of a project to build a super port in off the coast of South Louisiana. We're also, as you know, the industry is also involved in trying to put together a super port complex offshore Texas. There's also some discussion offshore Mississippi. There's also some discussion, I think, offshore the East Coast, Governor, and I've forgotten just exactly the locations, but this is all in the interest of trying to bring oil to the American consuming public at the least possible cost, because believe me, the economy of shipping oil in these larger tankers is significant. And it would reflect itself in the cost to the consuming public in this country. And I don't think this is inconsistent at all with our desire to get on with exploration on the Outer Continental Shelf, because I think if we were to do it, all we're going to do is minimize our dependency on foreign sources of energy for the next decade or two. We're still going to be importing, and therefore, I think it behooves us to import it in the most efficient manner. And I might add, and although I realize this is controversial, I might add, in our best judgment, in the safest manner. Because if you can get these big ships underway, you've got less traffic on the high seas, you've got less traffic in your shipping lanes. And I'm not an expert in that area, but our shipping people have gotten into this, and they've convinced me, and I think a lot of people share this, that it's the safest way to move this oil. So I really don't think that any of these positions are inconsistent. I'd like to say again, I'm very envious of our competitors that they don't have this, that we don't have the same problem they do vis-a-vis all this oil in Alaska. But we're still looking, I might add, and hopefully we'll find some.
Question in the front row.
I'm Barbara Heller from the Environmental Policy Center in Washington. I would like to address two questions to Mr. Hughes and Mr. Haynes, and perhaps get Governor Byrne's reactions to their answers. Mr. Haynes, you stated earlier that the industry has been asking for accelerated leasing for years. However, in the most recent lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico last month, out of all the tracts that were offered, the industry bid on less than 30% of those leases. There are well-documented and I think generally agreed upon shortages in the industry of capital, labor, and drilling equipment. These have been stated by your trade journals, Offshore Magazine, as well as by the Federal Energy Administration. And the question is, how is the industry going to cope with accelerated leasing? To Mr. Hughes, you spoke about the very orderly process which you have been pursuing with regard to OCS development. This, however orderly it is now, has come about after very vigorous public opposition, and I think you will admit in reaction to it from the governors as well as from citizens groups. I would be very interested in knowing how now you are really trying to involve the public and the states. And this is in reaction to several things. You have issued proposed operating orders which were published in the Federal Register about a month ago for the Gulf of Alaska. Yet the things which operating orders are supposed to be based on have not yet come out in the environmental impact statement for that area. It seems to me that's not an example of involving the public in your plans.
Mr. Haynes, you want to take the first question?
Yes, well, I think the thrust of your question was, we on the one hand are advocating accelerated leasing offshore, and on the other hand, the industry only bid on 30% of the leases offshore Texas here a few weeks ago, and that appears to be inconsistent. Well, I think the only way I can answer that question is that the oil industry, of course, is a risk-taking, to be sure, but also a profit-making enterprise. That's the reason we're in business, and let's face it. Now, certain areas are put up for bid. Various companies nominate various tracts and so forth, and the government decides in the final analysis which tracts are put up and which are not, and the government makes a decision that here are the tracts that are put up for bids. Well, now, our people sit down and we have a certain amount of information which we have acquired through our own efforts in terms of seismic information and that sort of thing. So we sit down and we make the best judgment we possibly can as to the potential of a particular block. It just so happened that the industry, apparently, I can only speak for my company, but we only bid on a few blocks because we only thought those were the blocks that had the potential and justified our investment and our effort. And after all, that's the name of the game. So I can only conclude that the rest of the industry looked at it exactly the same way, and therefore a number of these blocks were not bid on. But I think to put this in the proper perspective, and incidentally, an awful lot of this area was area in which very little activity has taken place in the past. Now, I'd like to go back but remind you of this, though, that offshore the Gulf in its entirety for the year 1974, the oil industry, as I recall the figures, bid about $2.48 billion on leases in excess of the second high bid. I make that point only to suggest that the bidding process is of some economic value to the federal government. As a matter of fact, since about 1958 or something of that sort, the oil industry has spent $60 billion offshore. The government has derived $15 billion from the industry, and the industry has a gross income of just about $15 billion. So we're a long way from breaking even, but I repeat that if the government will put up the blocks that have exploration potential, the industry will assess the risk and the gain, the possible gain, and we'll get in there and play the game, and we'll find some oil too.
Secretary Hughes?
Second part of your question, first of all, we don't think it's fair to characterize our program as one that was created in response to public pressures. The orderly program has been in existence for many years now. We admit we're making some modifications to the program, and we are making a very deliberate attempt to work more closely with governors and mayors who are involved because of the concerns that their constituents have with respect to offshore development in areas where it's never occurred before. But we do think that our system has needed to be modified in some ways, but in terms of the process is pretty much the same. And we think that public involvement, either directly through public hearings, is an important vehicle for the department as well as the federal government to gain input to the program. But we think through increased cooperation through the states, beyond just the environmental impact state process, to the point of the commitment Secretary Morton made at his meeting with Governor Byrne and his fellow East Coast governors in January, that the Secretary would invite the governors in to look at the final decision document on whether or not to have a sale or not have a sale, is certainly a step forward in terms of the government opening its process to the public, be it the public at large or the public as represented by state and local officials. On the matter of our OCS orders for Alaska being published before the environmental impact statement is written, I don't have a solid answer except that our system's a dynamic system, and we certainly do not mean to imply that there won't be more OCS orders if something new and unusual is found through the EIS process in Alaska. But we need to get things done in an orderly fashion, and if we wait until everybody's objection to the program is taken care of, no matter how small, then the process will be stalled for a long period of time, and we don't think that's in the public interest.
Governor Byrne was asked to react to this as well.
Only a small portion of it, and that is we don't call it pressure, we call it discussion. We've had discussions, and I appreciate Secretary Morton having these discussions with us, and he did say in his testimony before the Congress on March 14th that it was a result of our discussions that he invited the governors to participate in the evaluation of environmental impact. I have often said that I appreciate the availability of the Secretary, Mr. Hughes, to have these discussions with us and to get our input and to evaluate that input.
Question in the third row.
Yes, I'm Robert Kahn with the Conservation Foundation and the National Energy Projects Advisory Board. My question is for both Secretary Hughes and for Captain Cousteau. We have heard in the discussion that we need the immediate use of the offshore oil resources. Captain Cousteau made the comment that if we use them up now in a time of peace, we might not have them in a time when they were more needed strategically. I wanted to ask the question of what about the responsibility for future generations of using up this immense source of oil in maybe 15 to 20 years when we do not know whether there will be other sources that will be available and will be beneficial to the people or not harmful. And the related question, which was not discussed, what is the government's policy on intense activity on conservation of energy, which may be the solution to not using it up and not doubling it the rate of use every few years?
Captain Cousteau?
I must insist on the fact that I said that I was against using up this oil if the replacement was not studied in the same time, because then the sacrifice would be useless. But if the appropriate research and development was made, I would support this bridge, because I think we do need it if we have a replacement for the future. Let me put that very clear. So it's a constructive approach, it's not a negative approach.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes?
Yes, I think basically we recognize that a decision could be made to save our additional domestic resources in the short term for some future generation, but that seems to present us with the option of massive dislocation in our present economy. If in fact we decide that we want to use half the energy next year that we use this year, it could be accomplished. We can do almost anything we want in this country, but there's a cost to it. And we think it's in the national interest to proceed in an orderly fashion to make domestic resources available over a period of time to the needs of the nation, hoping that our research programs over the long term on both fossil fuel research, gasification, liquefaction, and the other more exotic forms of energy supply, geothermal, solar, and nuclear, will certainly come in to take up most of the burden as we reach the year 2000. But that decision could be changed. The Congress in its wisdom could make a decision that we would not proceed with offshore development for some period of time. But there's a price for any sort of decision like that. So we think that the program that the federal government is pursuing now in cooperation with other levels of government, is the right decision. But it's certainly any decision in our society is open to question.
Question?
On the matter of conservation, we think that since last year we've taken about 1 million barrels a day out of the consumption patterns in this country, and that unless you go to legislated items like those proposed in the President's energy package, giving tax rebates for insulation and other incentives, monetary incentives for people to conserve, that you're not going to get much more by voluntary conservation. Then when you get into the business of mandatory conservation and asking people or directing that people can no longer have electric houses but would have to have some other source of energy, you again present the prospect of a massive dislocation. But we are certainly open to suggestions, and I think the administration is continuing to review with the Congress several variations on a national energy plan that would try and bring more conservation into the picture. But conservation alone cannot solve the problem. Those who would say that we can just, decide that we're not going to have any increase in energy consumption in this country haven't talked to the majority of Americans.
All right, Captain Cousteau wanted a brief reaction.
Very briefly. I think a lot more could be saved in energy conservation because it was said yesterday, for example, that the increase of price in the energy that is about to be obliged will hit first the poor people, which is a very, very solid statement. Well, why not put, as for tax, a sliding scale, each home having a low tariff for the first so many kilowatts, and then a much higher rate for those who can afford it. So nevertheless, this would push the rich ones to shut down the electricity behind. Today they don't care. And if you increase the price of electricity for everybody, you're going to hit the poor people.
Right. And this
so a sliding scale is a must.
Question in the room.
Jim Pardue, Chief Consultant to the Assembly Resources and Land Use Committee of the California Legislature. Back to the question of onshore facilities. I'm sure you're aware that the California Coast Commission is in the final stages of preparing its coastal zone plan for the 1976 legislature. Of course, that is going to be a very tough land use plan, and onshore facilities are going to be probably an element in that, or I don't know exactly how they're going to consider it. But with respect to Mr. Hughes, with respect to the federal government, are onshore facilities required for the kind of OCS drilling you're considering in California, or are there sufficient facilities already in place in California? And if the Coast Commission should deny permits for additional major facilities, what would that mean? Would there be a strong push by the federal government to try to preempt the state in this area?
There are no detailed answers to the question you've posed. Certainly there may be a need for additional onshore facilities in the California area. Whether that could be taken care of through expansion of existing facilities or whether new ones would have to be created is not yet known. And that's not something that we can predict today with any degree of finiteness, when the actions we're talking about may bring about the pressures 5, 6, or 10 years from now. On the matter of the coastal zone plan and the possibility that the coastal zone plan might preclude either directly or indirectly energy facility siting, that's an issue that, if it becomes a nationwide phenomenon, might require that the federal government, in fact, review whether or not the national interest is being served by a local area denying energy facility siting. So far, the issue of an energy siting bill has been discussed in the Congress at length over the last 5 or 6 years. Whether or not such a bill would pass this time is certainly open to speculation. But we have a concern with those who would say, that the federal government ought to wait till everybody's coastal zone plan is completed. If in fact, and first of all, there's no obligation for a state to complete one. They're encouraged under the coastal zone legislation to complete one, but it takes a long period of time to come up with a plan, and the plan we hope would be in place by the time the onshore impacts are realities, that in fact oil has been found and we need to make some provision ashore for the oil. But there's...
At that point, we're going to have to wrap it up. We're grateful for the stimulating discussion and for the questions from the audience. Certainly we want to thank our panel. Mr. Haynes, thank you very much. Captain Cousteau, Governor Byrne, Secretary Hughes, thank you very much on behalf of the National Energy Project.